Mike Davis, if you're willing to stand, from the DYS. He was our point person for all the juvenile offense cases that I handled in my 9 years, and that was a strong, good partnership we had with them. What I want to talk about is spotlight two adult cases that I oversaw during my time here in Lane County. And one of them was out of the DA's office. The other one was in partnership with the Public Defender's Office, arranging a deferred adjudication. What I want you to understand is that the kinds of encounter opportunities that we're talking about can come at a lot of points in the system. They can come as a diversion. They can come as a as a pretrial, not even into the court system at all. In fact, in our county, we get things directly from the police as a way to just simplify all the paperwork. It can be a DA diversion. It can be a deferred adjudication. It can be a condition of probation that's set at sentencing time. It can also be a condition of post-prison supervision. So there's a lot of points that any of this work can be done. The one case that stands out in my mind that involved a DA diversion in this county was, some of you may remember, on September 11, 2001, was a hate crime to the Muslim Center. And within a few hours of that morning, the person who had called in, it was an offender in his 30s, was tracked down. And because there was enough partnership network in place, we were able to move very quickly into preparation work and have joint victim offender work within 3 weeks of 911. Folks might remember Susan Treem and Steve Lauk. I don't know if some of you have worked with them, but back in the days, we had a restorative accountability board up in the Bethel neighborhood. So the framework was there. We were able to do intake work with the offender, who at that time was remorseful. He wasn't representing a hate group or anything like that. The Muslim couple that were involved, specifically, this is interesting, did not want to go into a court process because as representatives of the Muslim community, they did not want to even look vindictive. And they were so thankful to have a community-based process that allowed them to have that discussion, that learning, in order to resolve this, which ended up being very effective. We had two 2.5-hour meetings because the first one did come to a bit of an impasse, and we had a 2-week break, and then we came back together, and there was a real breakthrough. We have a video of that sometimes if you want to learn more about how that case unfolded. And then that offender had 5 different conditions to fulfill over the next half year in order to make amends to that case. Worked very well, and again, it was because a framework was in place with those partnerships with the DA's office at that time. The other case I want to spotlight is, and I think I probably worked with about 25 adult cases over my 9 years. They were all ad hoc kinds of cases that came up. And we didn't really have a funding base for them, but strategically we felt it was important for CMS to take on those cases, because what we were trying to do is strengthen our ties with victim services, with the DA's office, with the courts, public defender office. We wanted to have enough groundwork there so that when those cases came along, and the community could be there to support that something was ready to happen. So in a way, our discussion today is trying to build on a lot of those smaller discussions and opportunities that go back over the last 12 years that I know I was a part of. But we need to have more of a predictable framework. We need to know where it's going to be saving some money and where the referrals can act smoothly. So the other one I want to spotlight was a deferred adjudication on a burglary case. And we worked with the Public Defender's Office to see if before a sentencing, this young man could go through a restorative process with a church that was burglarized. And the pastor and ministry team wanted to be part of a dialogue opportunity. This young man and another young man, I think early to mid-20s, had been involved with drinking and breaking into a church and caused some damage. There was a little bit of theft involved. definitely affected the church in terms of their sense of trust and security and safety. And so we were able to pull together some dialogue around that, some conditions of community service. And what I like about this case is that it was in conjunction with other necessary sanctions of the court, because this guy needed to have some serious treatment. And so when he went to sentencing, he was already fulfilled with our part of the restorative justice encounter opportunity. But the judge said, I want you to go to a 60 to 90 day in-house treatment, and you need to do X, Y, and Z by such and such a time. So it's a good example of how it wasn't just a pure diversion, but it was an opportunity to do that relational mending in conjunction with other necessary sanctions. And I'm proud to say that that offender is 5 years sober. Has held a job at a publishing company that's just a couple blocks from here, and is a great example of someone who's turned things around. He's a leader in the Oxford houses in the area. It's a great example of how, with the right kinds of supports, we're going to have offenders on the contributing side of our communities and not the depletion side.
If you wouldn't mind if I introduced him to you. We actually have in the audience today an actual victim of a crime that went through our restorative justice process. And I'll give you a quick outline of the crime, and then I'm going to introduce you to him, and then he's going to tell you how the process worked or didn't work for him. I don't know, it's about 7 years ago now, or 8 years ago, I'm not sure exactly, but there was a group of youngish aged, what many people refer to as skinheads, that committed an attack on the local Jewish temple here in Eugene, and had drawn swastikas onto bricks and things and thrown them through the windows during an actual service that included people in the audience who were Holocaust survivors, or obviously relatives of Holocaust survivors. You can just imagine what must have been going on. I mean, there was just the initial fear, like, what the heck's going on? But then when you realize that it was a hate crime, and when your culture is that for thousands of years that people have been trying to annihilate you as a culture, what must they have been going through and thinking about? And we have here today one of the rabbis at the time of the temple, Rabbi Maurice Harris, who I'd like to invite to come up and share his experience with it.
Yeah, I want to bring my wife Melissa Crowd with me because she was actually more of a leader than I was in the process that took place with one of the offenders, and it would take a long time to sort of lay out the whole story. So what I'll just do is share that the senior rabbi and myself, I was the associate rabbi at the time, and a number of other members of the congregation were approached with the possibility of engaging in a restorative dialogue with one of the offenders. And this is an offender who had been expressing the desire to offer amends and offer apologies. And as you can imagine, this was not an easy thing for us as clergy to weigh, and for the leadership of the congregation to weigh, because the folks in the congregation had divided feelings about whether or not to proceed. Long story short is we did proceed with some skepticism. It was a bumpy and long and winding process, but what resulted over more than a year's time was that my wife Melissa put together a basic curriculum of study, and then I helped and she helped meet with this young man every couple weeks over a long stretch of time, so that he could learn. He wanted to learn more about Judaism and the group of people that he had offended against. And we were getting some things that we needed as well from him. He had made some very clear and unequivocal disavowals of his associations with this other group, and there were some other circumstances that were part of his family story and life story that over time built trust between us. And I'll just say that you know, in the final analysis, it was a transformative experience for me, and one of the most profound things I experienced during 8 years of congregational work. And I'll give Melissa a chance to speak now.
So at the time of this, the offense happened in 2002. We moved here in 2003, and I was involved with CMS as a volunteer, so I was sort of able to be a bridge person. And Ted was actually the person at CMS who took the lead in working on this. And to me, actually, that really exemplifies how people in the RJ community are really willing to go the extra mile to do what needs to be done when an opportunity presents itself. Because without any funding to support this whatsoever, Ted really took it on to try to make this process work for the congregation and for this young man. So it wasn't just that we studied with him over a year, but the entire group, which included community members, other congregants, and the other rabbi as well, we met. And Ted was there and some other volunteers at all of those meetings. And so, you know, whereas a usual model is that the victim and the offender come together once or twice, this was a year-long process. And so the other thing that really illustrates for me is that, as many people spoke about, the restorative principles and values are what's important. It's not a cookie-cutter thing. And when, you know, when a community is able to respond in accordance with those values, the actual intervention can be tailored really very specifically to those circumstances. And I think that the people who were involved in that dialogue did find it very powerful. And this young man, again, true to what has been discussed earlier, had experienced some very, very horrible trauma. And his brother was a leader in this white supremacist community. And there had been issues of mental health and drugs and suicide and all this stuff going on in his family. So he was a very lost person at that time. And so I think it was really wonderful for us, and we really appreciated CMS's work. And okay, so you know, I'll just say again, there were mixed reactions within the congregational community, and some people were more supportive, some were less supportive. But I think overall the response was very positive. And I just want to say that when we first started out, the concern of many of the people in the group and others in the congregation was that he's just using this to get out of a sentence. There was witness intimidation involved. He was involved in it, but his brother got a 10-year federal sentence. And so he was potentially facing a chunk of federal time. So the main concern was he's using this to get off. And by the end of it, the concern was, what will happen if the judge doesn't hear what we want to say about how we don't want him to go to federal prison? And I'll say that the judge really did hear what the community said about it and sent some work release, but he did not have to go into a federal prison. So we were very grateful for that.
I have one teeny little bit, really brief, but just because it was such a real learning point for me in being part of an RJ process. This guy really wanted to do something concrete to try and make amends. And one of the things we were struggling with was that there were enough people in our community who were supportive of what we were doing, but made it really clear that emotionally they just didn't want to engage with him. They didn't want to meet him. They didn't want to have him come to the synagogue and talk. He was good at sculpture, and he either wanted to do some kind of constructive physical work or create a sculpture or something. And one of the things that emerged was that just wasn't going to be something we could do that would accommodate the needs of the whole group of victims. And so we had to figure that out. And that was a learning piece for me. Just wanted to say that.
And actually, I'll just say the final thing. The feel-good moment on this was that we concluded the whole process with a Sabbath dinner at our house. Ted was there. He was there with his girlfriend, who he's still with, and everyone involved was there. And they came in early, and I thought we'd be going to services at 7 that evening, but because I figured, we're going to do this and wrap it up. And at 11 o'clock, people were still still there. So it was a really nice opportunity.
And by the way, there had been quite a bit of work with this youth offender before ever bringing them with a victim together. And that's a really important piece of the process, that we don't want to re-victimize the victims without knowing for sure going in that there is going to be some accountability and some responsibility taken on the offender's part. So there is a substantial amount of work and meetings going on with just the offender before we ever approach the victim. If you've heard me speak about restorative justice before, then you've probably heard this story, so I apologize if you're hearing it for a second time. But my favorite story to tell when I'm speaking about restorative justice, another case that we did here at CMS not too long ago, a woman had some very small children and their friends, and then her father, who was an elder man. He was actually a retired career military veteran. And they had tickets to a Trailblazer game. They live in Roseburg, so they drove in a minivan, all of them together, up to Portland. And on the way home, and it was a classic, Northwest, rainy, dark night on their way home, and some people up on top of one of the overpasses were throwing eggs at cars as they were driving by, and they nailed this car. And if you can imagine what an egg would do at a vehicle traveling at 65 miles per hour, it does this and blocks your vision. And so there was a whole bunch of stuff going on with the different people in that vehicle. The driver, the mother, obviously trying to keep her family safe, but instant fright and hits the brakes, and the car starts spinning out of control, and it almost ended very badly. They came very close to smashing into an embankment. And the elder veteran, of course, the sound of the egg hitting the windshield was quite loud, and for him there was this sort of flashback of an explosion kind of thing happening. And of course the kids all had their own levels of trauma and crying and hysteria and all that, with paramedics and all the lights and sirens and everything. It was just a very frightening experience for everybody. And that was all just in the first 30 minutes of this experience. And as they had time to process it and think about it, and all the layers of anger and frustration and all the different things that a victim might feel in a situation like that. Well, the police apprehended these fellows very quickly, and the county determined that they might be good candidates for restorative justice. So we started working with these offenders, and eventually contacted the victim when we thought the offenders were ready. The victim, now mind you, military father-in-law living in the home with her, her husband, current active duty, serving in Afghanistan at the time, and they owned a sort of a logging operation. So it's the picture is this sort of rural, military-oriented family, and at first she was just like, no, throw the book at them. I want to see them punished as severely as they can be. But over several conversations, eventually she agreed that there would be no harm in potentially trying this process, and that if it didn't work, and this is the case in most restorative justice cases, that if it doesn't work, the offender still will be held accountable under the traditional system. So she was game for trying it, and we eventually brought them together. And what Rabbi Maurice and Melissa were sharing with you is that in the traditional system, the primary ways of addressing the crime are either to remove somebody's liberty, and often sometimes also there will be some sort of restitution, some sort of money obligation that the court will impose on the offender. But there's very little freedom to custom tailor what an offender should have to do to mend the harm that might meet both the offender's needs as well as the victim's needs. And so in this case, this was one of those ones where they just came up with this beautiful, rich resolution that helped everybody that was involved in it. the woman had a lot of wood on her property and was getting ready for the winter, and her husband wasn't there, and the father was a bit older, and here are these three young, strapping 18, 19-year-olds. And so they agreed that these men were going to go to the property out in Roseburg for several times over a month or so period, and we're going to chop and stack wood. And the first day that they were there, the children, especially the small children who were feeling very protective of Mom, were very angry and it's being sort of mean to these teenagers that were on their property. And so they started doing this, but eventually it was one of the 7-year-old that noticed that the area where they were chopping the wood and the area where they were stacking the wood, there was a pretty good distance in there. And so the kid actually suggested, well, why don't we form an assembly line? And all the kids got involved in it too. So they were passing the wood along with each other, standing next to each other now. And this was after a couple of times of them being at the house. The very first day that they were there, the mom took lemonade out to the boys. By the last day that they were there, they were invited in for a meal with the family, and had by then completely rebuilt relationships and trust, and they'd gotten to explore all the stuff that had been bothering the victims, and like questions like why, what were you thinking? You don't often get answers to that in the traditional justice system, because people like Greg down there are telling them not to say anything. And so anyway, ended up really custom-tailored mending the harm that these boys had created, and they all eventually got to go on. One of their worries was that they weren't going to get to go into college with this record, that it was going to hurt their chances of getting into college. And she ended up writing letters for them, and now actually still keeps in touch with these boys and wants regular progress reports about how they're doing while in college. So it's a powerful tool. Is it a panacea? No. There are definitely bad people out there, and this isn't going to work for them. And that's when we need our police force, and that's when we need our prosecutors and our courts to keep those bad people from hurting us. But are there some people that are committing some crimes that might fit under this process? I think there are. I think there may be quite a few crimes that are being committed that could potentially be handled this way, and potentially for a whole lot less money. As Ted pointed out, the concept is that we're bringing, the community is going to take an elevated responsibility to addressing the crime in our community. We're not going to just put it all on the shoulders of our government. And so by joining together with an organization like Community Mediation Services and partnering with government, we can utilize the power of volunteerism to address these issues without it having to cost a great deal of money. It will take some money, and one of the questions, which I'm not going to get to, was, well, how do you fund this? If there's no money for police and prosecutors, how do we pay for this? And that is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. How do you do that? What is the answer? And again, it might be that community piece. We might need to do some educating of the public and seeing if we can't get some donations to do it. Everybody step up, either volunteer some time, contribute some resources to solving the problem. On the short-term solution is there might be some grants that we could apply for a pilot-type project, and we will pursue that sort of thing. Another possibility is that there might be some sort of fine that gets tacked on to what the offender has to pay to the system for committing the crime, and that a small portion of that could go to a restorative justice program. So, thank you for the panelists for sharing those stories. I really appreciate that very much, and especially to Melissa and Maurice for sharing your personal experience with it. I want to ask a few questions that the audience has come up with, but I also want to encourage each of you, if you have questions. Thank you. So now we'll start part 2 of the morning, and that's going to be, you've probably got a good sense of the overall principles or philosophy of restorative justice, and you still might have some questions, though, about, well, how does it actually work? What does it look like in practice? And so for the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to hear from 3 of the panelists. We're going to share actual case examples where restorative justice principles were applied to an adult criminal case. So, is Howard here? Yeah. Great. Do you want to go first, or you're already up?
Well, talking about moving these kind of things from the youth area to adult area, I thought, why not tell the first time we tried to do that? I directed the first program, considered the first program in the United States in Elkhart, Indiana, in the late 70s, and we were doing, as I said earlier, mostly altogether juvenile cases. And then we had a series of burglaries, 14 burglaries that we knew in the community that really had the community upset. So there's that relational disruption you're talking about. A fellow named Fred Palmer had come back from Vietnam and sort of formed a burglary ring, and he had broken into various places. And one couple, he and somebody, a partner, had backed the U-Haul truck up to the house while they were gone on their honeymoon and taking all the wedding presents and so forth. So we decided it was time we tried this out. We were kind of nervous, but one of the victims, one family of the victim, was a deputy sheriff and his wife. Fred had broken into the deputy sheriff's house and stolen, cleaned out a bunch of things. He a little alarmed when he got in there and saw the scanners and stuff. He hit one hit with it. And we knew Randy pretty well, and so we decided this would be our first case. So we took Fred, preparing them, talking with Fred the burglar, and Randy and his wife. We brought Fred back to the home, and we had what turned out to be a very powerful meeting, because a lot of the denial that Fred had about the damage he'd done and so forth went out the window when he actually saw the broken steel door and all of that, and when he heard how frightened the children were to be in their room and so forth. So we went through that process and came to an agreement. It was really worked out well. And then we went to a second victim, which was the one that had lost everything during their honeymoon. And that one, again, we were a little nervous. We learned along the way that this fellow had been at a hotel. Someone broken in, and he'd actually grabbed a gun and shot the guy. So we weren't sure how that was going to go. But again, it really went really well. It was really moving for the victims to meet this person, to find out not the boogeyman they thought, but a real person with some issues around post-trauma and stress and so forth. So we were going through a series of these, and the judge was pretty impressed with what was happening, and the law called for a mandatory prison sentence, and the judge, having seen what was happening, could not bring himself to impose a mandatory sentence. He said, Fred needs to go to prison for a limited time to understand what that's like, and then I'm going to pull him out, and he's going to make restitution. Unfortunately, the state Supreme Court didn't see it that way. And so eventually, the judge was threatened with contempt of court if he didn't impose the mandatory sentence. So Fred went to prison for a while. The interesting thing was that Randy, the deputy sheriff, became a friend of Fred and would go to jail to visit him. And one time he's on the way to, and it was on national TV. He's driving up to the jail, and he says, I told Fred when he was out that I was going on vacation, and then I just thought, I just told my burglar I'm going on vacation. But he said, I think the house would have been safer with Fred watching it than any other way. And Randy went on to become sheriff, running partly on support for restorative processes. And the interesting footnote to that is that Randy retired a couple years ago, and for a while decided he would be director of that program. So Randy went from victim to sheriff to director of that program. So that's how we got started, a little bit more dramatically than we had sort of intended. The judge decided he didn't want to continue being a judge, and so he left the bench and went to Eastern Europe to teach law and restorative justice. I won't guarantee all your cases are going to come up.
Rupert?
Now that I managed to get through the start. I've never done it that fast. So I'm sorry if I spoke that quickly, but I really wanted to try and tie it together. A couple of cases that I've been involved in, I think, show some of the wider wisdom of restorative justice. One of them involved a man who broke into a gas bar at midnight in a major Canadian city. He was drunk, and he demanded money, and the young woman behind the counter gave him the money. He tripped on the way out. She'd already pressed the button. The cops caught him. He had a bad record, but they decided they wanted to hold a sentencing circle for this guy. It was clear he was going to go to jail because of his record, but the young woman who had been behind the bar, she wanted to essentially yell at him, okay? And she started off doing that, but then because he was also there with his whole family, they told the long story they'd had as a family trying to keep this guy out of the worst behavior and into his best behavior. His best behavior, he'd been a journalist, he'd had partial university education, so he was up and he was down, he was up and he was down. And what happened there, and she recorded her responses on a RCMP videotape, was she lost her nightmare vision of this guy. Because she'd only seen him for like 10 seconds when he came in and demanded the money and then fled. And now she saw this humble, semi-broken down, but still potentially useful guy with his family who were really concerned about him. And she talked about losing the nightmare that she'd been carrying when she saw this human being in front of her. And he talked about stuff in his life, and that got to her. And she started talking about the fact that, well, the other ramification of what happened was her mother was now driving her crazy because her mother kept saying, where are you going to be tonight? Where are you going to park? Who's going to be with you? I don't want this to happen again. And she and her mother were they were both in the circle. They both had healing between the two of them. He ended up getting, I think, 18 months of jail. But they, at the conclusion of the circle, asked if he could, when he came out, work at the gas bar with her. And he did. And he hasn't been in trouble since that I'm aware of. This happened about 10 years ago. She then went to the RCMP and said, I want to make a film about how critical it was for the rest of my life that we had that circle. For my mother, for me, for losing my nightmare. And in that respect, I wanted to mention one other case that involved long-term sexual abuse within a family. It was dealt with in not sentencing circles, but in healing circles in a First Nation. And I watched the victim come in for the first of those circles. And the circle is composed of about 17 people, the vast majority of whom are women who have been sexually abused, but are now well along in their own healing path, and a couple of the men who have gone through the process and now feel it's safe for them to participate. During the 2 hours that I sat there, she never said a word. She just sat there. And what happened was all of the other people in the circle told their stories, and someone at the break said storytelling is the key to this. And they started to tell their stories of how they felt back when this happened to them. And bit by bit, their lives got told in story form to the circle. And as I watched what was going on, I thought there's some incredibly good stuff happening here. One is this woman who at that point was all curled in a ball in the corner, she started to realize, I'm not a freak. I'm not the only one who's ever felt so down, so dirty, so depressed, so blah, blah, blah. I'm not a freak, because these people have all felt similar kinds of stuff. Secondly, she started to learn the language of talking about her emotional dimensions. Many long-term victims have been so put down, and many Aboriginal people so put down, they are divorced from their emotional selves. They don't know what they're feeling, much less have the articulation skills to talk about them. So a whole lot of victim offender stuff. We have to be careful about the skill sets, as you were mentioning, the skill sets of people coming into these processes. They're not all Freudian psychoanalysts who can lay it all out to you. They need to be helped to be able to talk about themselves. So she was learning how to talk about those things. She was also learning that these women had all been where she was, and they weren't there anymore. They were able to talk, they were coming out, and this was a safe place. There was such a thing as a safe place for her to talk about these dreadful secrets that she's been carrying. And so the final thing that she learned out of it was, if they each had to find their own ways out of being the victims of long-term sexual abuse, as they told their stories, they talked about so-and-so came along and he helped me with this, and then this person did this, and then I took up this activity. They were all telling their separate stories. She came to the realization, as I saw it, that everyone has to find their own way out. There cannot be a psychologist who stands there and says, do A, B, C, D, I'll check off the box, the insurance company will pay, everything's fine now. I've been at those APSA sessions where guys gave their 12 steps to tick off the box of the insurance company, and you're healed. Baloney. These women all had to find their own ways out, and the woman who was listening to them not only understood that, but started to believe that she too could. She could get herself out of this. It was going to take 5 to 10 years, but she could be moving towards the positive. So those were all the things that happened by the other women telling their stories. The power of storytelling in these processes is just incredible.